Thanks for coming to listen to me. I'm Kim Davis. I'm the Associate Editor of the local East Village. I originally was the Community Editor, and we can talk a little bit about what the implications of that are. I'm just going to talk a little bit, first of all, about myself, otherwise you'll spend the time wondering why I've got this accent. And then I'll talk a little bit about the project, about some of the challenges we've faced, and I'll talk about the neighbourhood as well. And if we have time, I'll finish up talking a little bit about this whole idea of volunteer journalism and how that fits into the real world, if at all. I was just curious, I haven't met any of you before. Have any of you lived in the neighbourhood? I mean, some of you, I assume, have come here just for this course. Any of you have any prior experience living in the neighbourhood, or is it new to everyone?
Kind of. My mom lives in the city, so not too familiar with this neighborhood, more Midtown, but sure. More than just about school.
Okay, is anybody else here from New York or lived in New York? Yeah?
I'm just from the Upper East Side, so I normally stay up there, but yeah.
Okay. It's safe down here.
It's sad, but I love the East Village, but it's nice getting to know it.
Okay, cool. Anybody else?
I'm also from Manhattan. I went to high school on the Upper East Side.
Okay.
But by being a student at NYU, I've come to know the village a little bit.
Sure. Okay. In that case, obviously some of you are new to the neighbourhood, so I hope my comments aren't too simplistic. Who am I? Well, I was born just outside London. I grew up in England. I started visiting New York frequently about 20 years ago, partly for work and partly because I immediately fell in love with the place. And when I saw an opportunity to come here, originally on a temporary assignment, I was going to be here a year, I jumped at the opportunity. I came out here. That actually wasn't with a journalism job, which kind of explains my rather strange resume. I became a journalist when I was a teenager. Actually, my last year of high school, I submitted some articles to a music paper, which was very big then, it's still going, called the New Musical Express. And I was lucky, they were looking for young writers, and I started working for them right out of high school. Well, when I came out to New York sometime later, it was with kind of a corporate job, very boring, but it was a chance to come and live in New York, so I was really excited. And as things transpired, I put down roots here. I eventually got permanent residency, and I've lived in New York now for about 15 years, 10 years in East Village. I have a daughter who's a native New Yorker, which is a source of great pride, and she has been growing up in East Village. She's done all her schooling there. So despite the accent, I do feel part of the community, but I always have to explain it because I open my mouth and people say, what have you got to do with the East Village? So I've been here a long time. One of the quirks of my arrival in New York was that for some years I was on an employment visa and I couldn't actually work as a professional journalist. So I have a big gap in my journalism career there. Once I became a permanent resident, I could go back to writing professionally. Now that does have some relevance because during that period, what I started doing was writing on the internet. Initially on message boards and message forums, but then of course blogging became popular and I became a blogger. And I was an amateur blogger when the law forced me to be, and I became a professional blogger as soon as I could. So in terms of recent writing, I founded a food forum site called Mouthfuls Food, which you're welcome to check out. It's kind of, I think of it as Chowhound with brains. I've also been publishing my own blog for, I think, 4 years now, called At the Sign of the Pink Pig. This is a plug, www.pinkpignyc.com. And I kind of explain it as dining and the arts. The main focus is restaurant reviews, but I also write about exhibitions, gallery openings, books, you know, anything. That's a great thing about publishing your own blog. You can really choose what you're going to cover. I do writing for private clients. And recently, a new thing for me, I've been writing about the internet, about the future of the internet, digital media, social media, all that kind of thing. And that's been a real eye-opener. And it's kind of not planned, but it's nice the way it's all come together for me. Doing the journalism again, getting involved in hyperlocal journalism, in blogging, writing about the internet. It all has some kind of shape to it, believe it or not. I publish a dining guide to New York, and this is what we call a book. Paper, remember that? That's really cool. It's not just online. It's called Eating the Apple, and I'm just about to start work on the 3rd edition of that. But you know, I grew up as a print journalist, so the world has changed, you know, during my time writing. I think in the last year I've had 1 article in print. Everything else I've written, countless thousands of words it seems, has appeared on digital platforms online. And that's really the way the world looks now. I should say, if anyone's got any questions, and I got that out of the way, just feel free to jump in, but we'll have time for questions at the end. I'll tell you a little bit about this project. I got involved in it, I guess, May of last year, although it only went online in September, I think around about Labor Day. So it's been less than a year publishing. But it was presented to me, the opportunity originally, as the job of being community editor. And there were two strings to this. One was to generally be an ambassador to the community, to go out and meet people, tell them about the local. Also to recruit community contributors. And as I'm sure you all know, we have kind of two parallel teams on the local. We have students based out of this building, out of NYU, and we also have this ragtag mob of people actually live in the community. Some of them very long-term residents, some of them just transient. Also, we have some people who don't literally live within our borders, but work here or spend a lot of time here. And we look to them to provide articles, photographs, video on occasions, whatever they can, whatever they're willing to put together. And we open our doors pretty wide. We don't say we only want this kind of content. We really let them suggest to us what they want to write about. So the site has been pretty broad in that way, I think. The second strand to my position was to write about stories arising out of NYU. The reason for that is, of course, the site. It's an NYU site on our New York Times platform, and if any stories came up which really directly affected those institutions, they wanted to have an independent voice. So I'm a freelancer. I'm not actually employed by NYU, let alone by the New York Times. I work on a freelance basis, and I have editorial control over what I say about these kinds of stories. In fact, although that was presented to me as quite an important part of the position, it's taken very little time because we're an East Village hyperlocal site. And of course, most of NYU, not all of it, most of it is outside East Village. We do have some very large halls of residence. But in practice, the stories about NYU which really deserve to be on the local East Village are few and far between. The one I've been involved in most is, of course, the 2031 plan, which is for very substantial expansion of NYU. And that's been hard to cover in a way, not because it's been hard to access. People have been very forthcoming in terms of giving interviews and giving me information. I mean, both the university and also the people who are really the entrenched opposition to the plan, like the Greenwich Village Society of Historical Preservation, other groups like that. It's been no problem talking to people. But the tricky thing about the story is that the bulk of the plan relates to NYU's so-called core campus, which is around, as you all know, Washington Square. And really, for the local East Village, it's been like kind of chasing phantoms, because if that plan doesn't go through, if it falls apart, then the East Village is vulnerable to NYU deciding to simply come in there in the real estate market and buy properties and move departments or students in. But we don't know that that's going to happen, and it's really hard to speculate about it while the main plan for the core is still underway. So it's a story I've been following for a year now, but relatively few articles on it, because each time something happens, you look at it and say, does it affect the East Village? And the answer usually is, we just don't know. So that's been tricky to cover in that way. I'm going to pause. Oh, no, let me just talk to you about how that position evolved. I'm now, as I said, associate editor. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that I don't think anyone quite envisaged when we set out just how much editorial work there would be on the community contribution side of this. I suppose we might have thought in the early days we were going to be flooded with contributions from people who are very keen to see their work online, be on the New York Times platform. And we've been flooded with photos. We have some wonderful photographers working out there, some really great material. It's been much harder work getting written contributions. If anyone who's in the community and watches this video online, please get in touch. But it's been very time consuming to go out there to find people who are willing to write, then to encourage them to keep, almost on a daily basis, emailing them. Have you got a new idea for us? How's that story coming along? Have you any idea when we might get it? And looking for more people to write, and then editing the copy. When I first interviewed for the job, I was asked if if I could edit copy, and I said, sure. I didn't realize how much copy editing there would be. So it gradually evolved from being a community position to actually really helping Rich Jones, the editor, to run the blog. And in fact, for a period of some months, I was running it 2 days a week. How does a neighborhood come to be defined as that neighborhood we give that name to? Anyone want to take a go at that? There's a number of influences. I think we tend to have a sense, especially in New York, which is such a patchwork, that this neighborhood, those kind of people live there, and if it's different people, I must have crossed the street and gone into another neighborhood. So demographics play a role. What else? Any other ideas? I'll make it more specific. How do neighborhoods get their names?
Location.
No.
East Village.
Yeah, well, it's east of the West Village.
Yeah.
I mean, why is it called a village? That should be an easy question. How did it get to be called a village? It's really because it's low-rise.
Yeah.
Yeah. It looked, back in the day, 100 or more years ago, it was quite villagey. But if you think of like names of neighborhoods, old and new, Upper East Side, but that's location. NoHo, Soho, Tribeca. The names come from a variety of sources. It's partly historical, of course. Some neighborhoods in New York have had the same name for, a century or more. Chelsea, I'm sure, fits that category. It's named not for the borough in London, but there's an English guy had some land there. I can't remember. Look it up. That's like an old name, and then you get the newer names. Tribeca, I guess, that goes back to the 70s. Triangle below Canal. NoHo, and what's the other one? Nolita. Nolita's very new, isn't it? Nolita, north of Little Italy. Because another influence here is real estate. It's quite clear realtors name districts, and they try to change the names of districts. Take, for example, Bushwick, one of the up-and-coming areas of Brooklyn. Realtors right now are trying to get everybody to call it East Williamsburg. I mean, that's a significant influence. Now, coming back to our neighborhood, has it always been the East Village? Does anyone know, like, the history of the name? What would people have called it 100 years ago? It's kind of really obvious. Lower East Side.
Okay.
The whole of this neighborhood, like as you're saying, 14th Street, way on down, was known as the Lower East Side. The East Village name, I can't tell you exactly when it came into existence. It was certainly around by the end of the Second World War. It may go back further than that. But yeah, it got kind of called the East Village as a contrast to Greenwich Village, whether it was realtors or people living here. And they started to, I think, to want to distinguish the East Village as it was developing then from the historical Lower East Side, which had been very much the first stop for immigrants coming to the country and had been, from the late 19th century, a very densely populated and largely very poor area of Jewish, Eastern European, and other new immigrants. I mean, unless you're Native American, anyone here is an immigrant if you go back far enough, but we're talking about people just off the boat. And I think the East Village wanted to separate itself a little from that. So now everybody's in the habit of thinking of the Lower East Side as being like the area, I guess, below Houston on the East Side. It was all the Lower East Side if you go back far enough. So these names change. Now, this does have a point to it, which is that when this project was set up, somebody had to decide, okay, what's the East Village? I don't know who decided, whether it was a committee. We have those boundaries, and they're kind of reasonable, except there's been one very big change I've seen during my 10 years living. Let me tell you where I live. I'm not going to give you my phone number address, but I live on 6th Street, the far east end of 6th Street, on the corner of Avenue D, so I'm like way, way east. When I first moved here, there really was a tangible southern boundary along Houston Street. There was also a very tangible boundary, I would say, at Avenue A, more or less. Get my directions confused. So like west of Avenue A was very much the East Village. Below Houston really was a very different neighborhood. And east of Avenue A, when I first moved here, was an area nobody ever visited. When I first came to the city 20 years ago, very few people would be willing to go into that neighborhood. So we've seen a couple of big changes. The one I was first talking about, in the last few years, that neighborhood immediately south of Houston has changed from being a neighborhood which was absolutely dead at night. Dark windows, dark doorways, nothing down there. During the daytime, it was kind of like cheap clothes shops. They're still there. You've probably seen them. But nobody, unless you live there, nobody would bother going down there, not because it was dangerous. There was just nothing down there at night. Houston was where things stopped. Okay, you had Katz's on the other side of the street, but that was about as far as you went. Now, think about it now. I'm sure you all had opportunities to go out and sample the nightlife. Below Houston is almost the place to go. It's packed with clubs, restaurants, bars. That's been a transformation. I think that raises a question mark about the local East Village's boundaries, because many of our stories now just naturally cross that boundary and go on down there. It's very hard for us to report the top few blocks of the Bowery and not report the lower parts of the Bowery. And I think that's an interesting challenge for any kind of hyperlocal journalism, because of course news stories don't stop where you drew your border. The implications and the people involved will spread outside your borders. And that's been one tricky thing we've had to handle in terms of editorial content for the local, is deciding when to say this story is not for us because it's like 2 blocks away. Well, if it's an important story, you can't really do that. But at the same time, you have to be careful, because if you say, okay, we're going to cover things on the Bowery, and you cover stuff on 23rd Street, and it all becomes a nonsense after a while. So that's really something you have to work out as you go along. I want to talk also about that other boundary, which has slowly shifted. Like I said, I guess 15 years ago, nobody went east of Avenue A. And that boundary has gradually shifted. There's now all kinds of stuff happening on Avenue B. There's quite a restaurant row on Avenue B. And then, you know, I've been living in the neighborhood and watching these changes. And Avenue C, now if you go to Avenue C, wander around, there's boutique coffee shops, there's specialist cheese stores. I mean, really, just in my time, it was unthinkable. There are 2 independent wine stores, one on Avenue C, one immediately off it. Very nice places. You go in there, you can read wine magazines, you can chat to the proprietors. Within the last, less than 10 years ago, the only way you could buy wine on Avenue C was through a slot in bulletproof glass. It really has changed that much and that dramatically, just in my own time there. This again presents a kind of challenge in terms of the local East Village, the website, because although that boundary has shifted, this really is not a homogeneous community. The community within our boundaries, as we've defined it, is not a homogeneous community, because the community east of Avenue B is really very much its own community. Of course, there is integration to some degree, but it's a Hispanic community. For many, many years Puerto Rican. I've got friends down there who of Puerto Rican heritage who were born on Avenue C. Their parents, their grandparents lived there. That goes back a long way. And now we have really a very quickly growing Dominican community there as well. And really, it'd be nice to think that, you know, 3rd Avenue and Avenue B and Avenue C are all much the same kind of people. They're not. They're really different people, different communities, but with different issues as well and different topics. And that's been a huge challenge for us as a resource for the community as we define it. Because I often get the feeling that some of the things we identify for the local East Village as being of interest and exciting or of concern, problems, we often inadvertently mean that they're issues or problems or things of great interest to people like west of Avenue A. Okay, now I know you haven't had all of you a huge chance to explore around here. What do you think might be some, let's take this in 2 stages. Let's talk about west of Avenue A. I'm talking about 1st, 2nd, 3rd Avenue, right over to this area where we are now. In terms of concerns, quality of life concerns, what do you think if you ask people they might talk about?
Increasing rents.
Increasing rents, sure. What about the big G word?
Gentrification.
Gentrification, you hear that a lot. Anything else? What about the types of businesses opening? You ever heard we have too much of certain kinds of businesses? I wasn't thinking of that so much. Bars, people say there's too many bars, there's too many restaurants, too much noise, right? Too many New York students, NYU students. Big complaints about change. we had a long-running story, some of you may have gone back and looked at it, about the little building 35 Cooper Square. This was like, what was it, early 19th century? It was very old anyway, nice little old house. And of course developers ripping it down to build what would doubtless be a monstrosity. And there was concern about that. I don't think it was community-wide concern. And in fact, we were bold enough to print a little piece about one of the students here who essentially said, well, I don't care about 35 Cooper Square. It doesn't mean anything to me. And that really outraged a lot of people. But I tell you what, if you were to go over to Avenue B or Avenue C and do a vox pop, walk up and down the street with a microphone and ask people, what about 35 Cooper Square? And you spend a long time finding anyone resident over there who'd even heard of 35 Cooper Square. And, you know, I don't think I'm going out on a limb when I talk about quality of life issues over in that neighborhood being certainly about rents, certainly about cost of living, but about things like housing, transport, bringing in the money every week. It's really a community with quite distinct groups within it. And I will just pause there again to see if there are any questions, because I want to get on to what might be my last topic. I can talk all day. Anything on that? Okay. I think this influences the kind of contributions we get for the local East Village as well. And the New York Times started this up. I know they've done a couple of projects before, one in Fort Greene, and the other one I think in New Jersey. I kind of missed that one. I've certainly looked at the Fort Greene side, obviously, and met some of the people who work on that. I don't know what the New York Times expected when it came to the East Village. I sometimes get the impression that they thought they would get a lot of input and a lot of contributions from just regular folk, like the regular downtrodden downtown working classes, who would want to tell them about we've got rats in the basement, or, you know, our landlord won't switch the electricity on. We might get some of those stories if we could get more contributions from Avenue C and Avenue D. But in fact, if you look at that western part of the East Village, First, Second, Third Avenues, over to Broadway, think about it, it's probably one of the most prosperous neighborhoods in the city. I mean, it may not be the Upper East Side, but, you know, it's expensive, really expensive to live in. And I tell you what, can anyone suggest a neighborhood in the city which is a more important nightlife hub than the East Village? Tricky, isn't it? Greenwich Village, West Village is still in there. I'd say the other obvious one is Times Square, but of course the big difference is the meatpacking district. Absolutely, that's really been up and coming recently. Whereas Times Square is mainly visitors, so it's a slightly different thing. But yeah, the East Village is one of the 2 or 3 most important nightlife hubs. And what about the arts? Now, a lot of art activity, artistic practice, has moved across the river to Brooklyn because of rents. But still, arts in the East Village, huge. Studios everywhere. I would say a lot of people working in the East Village, an unusually high proportion, are involved in arts or design, whether it be I'm a painter or I run a store where we sell cute jewelry that my friend makes. You know, the very, very broad sense of art and design, unusually high proportion. So, of course, what we've had in terms of contributions, and they're really great, tend very much to be from people who are involved in the arts, are involved in writing. In other words, very few contributions, I think there have been a few, but very few from people who have never been involved in producing content before. And I don't know if that's what the New York Times expected, but yeah, a lot of our contributions come from people who are writers, who want to be journalists. I'm not even counting the students, for people who are journalists, perhaps not doing it full time. So it's really a kind of an unusual professional pool of contributors that we've actually drawn in. And the challenge, just to wrap things up, the challenge in terms of the local's original mission, as it's set out, is to see if we can go beyond those barriers and bring in people from the community who wouldn't otherwise perhaps have a voice. I think that's a really difficult thing to do, and it relates to the whole question of what is an amateur journalist, a community journalist. which is very much a topic of debate now. And I know Jay Rosen, of course, has written a lot about that, and I occasionally disagree with him. I think he's a little idealistic about some of the possibilities. So I will stop talking there, and hopefully you can ask me something about what I've been saying.
Okay. Two things. The first question is, you mentioned how you worked a lot with different, I guess, with food. Is there a place you'd recommend around here for lunch soon?
Yeah, I definitely recommend you buy my book. It's called Eating the Apple.
Okay.
So you'll find it on Amazon.
Okay. Is there a place around here that you would recommend?
For lunch?
Yeah, for lunch.
Oh boy. You could walk across. Oh, that's not open for lunch. Ask me something about journalism.
Okay. You talked about how a lot of the users in the East Village are very media savvy. Coming from an international background, or from England, have you seen anything like the hyperlocal blogs that are coming up around here in London?
Sadly, I'm probably not the guy to ask because I've been out here so long. I used to go back and visit a lot. I honestly don't know, but it would be really interesting to go and take a look. I mean, just to give you a slightly more positive response, it really is amazing how many local blogs this neighborhood supports. It's really incredible. I mean, I don't want to give them all publicity here, but you know, I mean, if I started, I could probably name 7 or 8 without drawing breath. So it's an extraordinary concentration there, which makes it a very competitive environment.
Hi, I have I guess a 2-part question.
Okay.
You said it's another food question. You write about food. Have you had any previous food education?
Okay, that's the first part.
Yes, and then do you want me to?
Go ahead.
I love food, and I would love to write about food, but I haven't had food education. Do you think you need a good? I think you need a really good knowledge of food to write about food. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question in terms of the other stuff I do. And I'll say one thing is that it is a saturated market. If you think there's a lot of East Village local blogs, how many food blogs are there? Yeah. It is insane. I'm lucky because mine is very high profile. No, seriously, clearly you don't need an education. The reason I say that is that who is the single most influential media voice on food in the city? I'm not talking about an actual name, but a position, a job in New York media. Who moves the restaurant market? New York Times, the New York Times restaurant critic, hugely influential. The current critics, Sam Sifton, previous Frank Bruni, before that William Grimes, I'm not aware that any of them had any formal food education at all. If they did, I apologize. I don't think they did. If you go back, you'll find some people who had chef's training. So do you need formal education to review restaurants and write about food? No. I think it would be difficult if you couldn't fry an egg. I think you need to be able to cook. What you do need, I believe, is very broad experience. I find some of the food writers out there, they can write well, they love food, but if they make a judgment about a restaurant or a dish, and it's the first time they've had it or the first time they've been to that kind of restaurant, it's of limited value. They might say, I love this, and you want to say, well, what else have you tried? So, unfortunately, years of calorie intake is, I think, the most important thing. Anybody else? Well, thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you.